The State and Revolution, Chapter 2, The Experiences of 1848 through 1851, Section 1, On the Eve of Revolution. The first productions of mature Marxism, The Poverty of Philosophy and the Communist Manifesto, were created on the very eve of the Revolution in 1848. For this reason, we have in them, side by side with the statement of the general principles of Marxism, a reflection, to a certain degree, of the concrete revolutionary situation of the time. Consequently, it will possibly be more to the point to examine what the authors of these works say about the state immediately before they draw their conclusions of the experiences of the years 1848 through 1851. In the course of its development, wrote Marx in The Poverty of Philosophy, the working class will replace the old bourgeois society by an association which excludes classes and their antagonism, and there will no longer be any real political power, for political power is precisely the official expression of the class antagonism within bourgeois society. It is instructive to compare this with the general statement of the idea of the state disappearing after classes have disappeared, the statement contained in the Communist Manifesto written by Marx and Engels a few months later, to be exact, in November 1847. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the way of the proletariat. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to literally promote the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to establish democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Here we have a formulation of one of the most remarkable and most important ideas of Marxism on the subject of the state, namely the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx and Engels began to term it after the Paris Commune, and also a definition of the state in the highest degree interesting, but nevertheless also belonging to the category of forgotten words of Marxism, the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class. This definition of the state, far from having ever been explained in the current propaganda and agitation literature of the official social democratic parties, has been actually forgotten, as it is absolutely irreconcilable with reformism, and it's a slap in the face of the common opportunist prejudices of Philistine illusions about the peaceful development of democracy. The proletariat needs the state. This is repeated by all the opportunists, social chauvinists, and Trotskyists, who assure us that this is what Marx taught. They forget, however, to add that, in the first place, the proletariat, according to Marx, needs only a state which is withering away, that is, a state which is so constituted that it begins to wither away immediately and cannot but wither away. And secondly, the workers need a state that is a proletariat organized as the ruling class. The state is a special organization of force. It is the organization of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, the exploiting class only, i.e. the bourgeoisie. The toilers need the state only to overcome the resistance of the exploiters, and only the proletariat can direct this suppression and bring it into fulfillment, for the proletariat is the only class that is thoroughly revolutionary, the only class that can unite all the toilers and exploited in the struggle against the bourgeoisie, in completely displacing it. The exploiting classes need political rule in order to maintain exploitation, i.e. in the selfish interest of an insignificant minority and against the vast majority of the people. The exploited classes need political rule in order to completely abolish exploitation, that is, in the interest of the vast majority of the people and against the insignificant minority consisting of the slave owners of modern times, the landowners and the capitalists. The petty bourgeois democrats, these sham socialists who have substituted for the class struggle dreams of harmony between classes, imagined even in the transition to socialism in a dreamy fashion, not in the form of the overthrow of the rule of the exploiting class, but in the form of peaceful submission of the minority to a majority conscious of its aims. This petty bourgeois utopia, indissolubly connected with the idea of the states being above classes, in practice led to the betrayal of the interests of the toiling classes, as was shown, for example, in the history of the French revolutions in 1848 and 1871, and in the participation of, quote, socialists, unquote, in bourgeois cabinets of England, France, Italy, and other countries at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Marx fought all his life against this petty bourgeois socialism, now reborn in Russia in the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik parties. He carried his analysis of the class struggle logically right to the doctrine of political power, the doctrine of the state. The overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, as the particular class which, by the economic conditions of its existence, is being prepared for this work and is provided both with the opportunity and the power to perform it. While the capitalist class breaks up and atomizes the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois strata, it wheels together, unites and organizes the town proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of its economic role in large-scale production, is capable of leading all the toiling and exploited masses who are exploited, oppressed, crushed by the bourgeoisie not less and often more than the proletariat, but who are incapable of carrying on the struggle for their freedom independently. The doctrine of the class struggle, as applied by Marx to the question of the state and of the socialist revolution, leads inevitably to the recognition of the political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e., of a power shared with none and relying directly upon the armed forces of the masses. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie is realizable only by the transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class, able to crush the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeoisie, and to organize, for the new economic order, all the toiling and exploited masses. The proletariat needs state power, the centralized organization of force, the organization of violence, both for the purpose of crushing the resistance of the exploiters and for the purpose of guiding the great mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, the semi-proletarians, in the work of organizing the socialist economy. By educating a workers' party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, capable of assuming power and leading the whole people to socialism, of directing and organizing the new order, of being the teacher, guide, and leader of all the toiling and exploited in the task of building up their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. As against this, the opportunism predominant at present breeds in the Workers' Party representatives of the better-paid workers who lose touch with the rank and file, quote, get along fairly well under capitalism, and sell their birthright for a mess of pottage, that is, renounce their role of revolutionary leaders of the people against the bourgeoisie. The state, that is, the proletariat, organizes the ruling class. This theory of Marx is indissolubly connected with all his teaching concerning the revolutionary role of the proletariat in history. The culmination of this role is proletarian dictatorship, the political rule of the proletariat. But if the proletariat needs the state as a special form of organization of violence against the capitalist class, the following question arises almost automatically. Is it thinkable that such an organization can be created without a preliminary breakup and destruction of the state machinery created for its own use by the bourgeoisie? The Communist Manifesto leads straight to this conclusion, and it is of this conclusion that Marx speaks when summing up the experience of the Revolution of 1848 through 1851. Section 2. Results of the Revolution. On the question of the state which we are concerned with, Marx sums up his conclusions of the Revolution of 1848 through 1851 in the following observations contained in his work, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. But the Revolution is thorough. It is still on its way through purgatory. It is completing its task methodically. By December 2nd, 1851, the day of Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat, it had completed one half of its preparatory work. It is now completing the other half. First, it perfected parliamentary power, so that it could overthrow it. Now, when it has achieved this, it is perfecting executive power, reducing it to its purest forms, isolating it, setting it over against itself as the sole object of reproach, so that it can concentrate against it its forces of destruction. And when it has completed this second half of its preparatory work, Europe will leap to its feet and shout with joy, "Well grubbed, old mole!" This executive power, with its huge bureaucratic and military organization, with its extensive and artificial state machinery, a horde of 500,000 officials in addition to an army of another 500,000, this frightful body of parasites wound like a caul about the body of French society, and clogging its every pore, arose in time of the absolute monarchy in the period of the fall of feudalism, which it helped to hasten. The first French Revolution developed centralization. But at the same time it developed the scope, the attributes, and the servants of the government power. Napoleon perfected this state machinery. The legitimate monarchy and the July monarchy added nothing to it but a greater division of labor. Finally, in its struggle against the revolution, the parliamentary republic found itself compelled to strengthen with its repressive measures the resources and the centralization of government power. All revolutions brought this machine to greater perfection, instead of breaking it up. The parties which alternately contended for supremacy locked on the capture of this vast state edifice as the chief spoils of the victor. In this remarkable passage, Marxism makes a tremendous step forward in comparison to the position of the Communist Manifesto. There, the question of the state is still treated extremely in abstract, in the most general terms and expressions. Here the question is treated in a concrete manner, and the conclusion is most precise, definite, practical, and palpable. All revolutions which have taken place up to the present have helped to perfect the state machinery, whereas it must be shattered, broken to pieces. This conclusion is the chief and fundamental thesis in the Marxist theory of the state. Yet it is this fundamental thesis which has been not only completely forgotten by the dominant official social democratic parties, but directly distorted, as we shall see later, by the foremost theoretician of the Second International, Karl Kautsky. In the Communist Manifesto are summed up the general lessons of history, which force us to see in the state the organ of class domination and lead us to the inevitable conclusion that the proletariat cannot overthrow the bourgeoisie without first conquering political power, without obtaining political rule, without transforming the state into the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and that this proletarian state will begin to wither away immediately after its victory, because in a society without class antagonisms, the state is unnecessary and impossible. The question as to how, from the point of view of historical development, the replacement of the capitalist state by the proletarian state shall take place is not raised here. It is precisely this question which Marx raises and solves in 1852. True to his philosophy of dialectical materialism, Marx takes as his basis the experience of the great revolutionary years 1848 through 1851. Here, as everywhere, his teaching is the summing up of experience illuminated by a profound philosophical world conception and a rich knowledge of history. The problem of the state is put concretely. How did the bourgeois state, the state machinery necessary for the rule of the bourgeoisie, come into being? What were its changes? What its evolution in the course of bourgeois revolutions and in the face of the independent actions of the oppressed class? What are the tasks of the proletariat relative to this state machinery? The centralized state power particular to bourgeois society came into being in the period of the fall of absolutism. The institutions are especially characteristic of this state machinery, bureaucracy and the standing army. In their works, Marx and Engels mention repeatedly the 1,000 threads which connect these institutions with the bourgeoisie. The experience of every worker illustrates this connection in the clearest and most impressive manner. From its own bitter experience, the working class learns to recognize this connection. That is why it so easily acquires, so completely absorbs the doctrine revealing this inevitable connection, a doctrine which the petty bourgeois democrats either ignorantly and lightheartedly deny, or still more lightheartedly admit in general, forgetting to draw adequate practical conclusions. Bureaucracy and the standing army constitute a parasite on the body of bourgeois society, a parasite born of the internal antagonisms which tear that society asunder, but essentially a parasite clogging every pore of existence. The Kautskyist opportunism prevalent at present within the official social democracy considers this view of the state as a parasitic organism to be the peculiar, exclusive property of anarchism. Naturally, this distortion of Marxism is extremely useful to those Philistines who have brought socialism to the unheard-of disgrace of justifying and embellishing the imperialist war by applying it to the term of national defense, but nonetheless, it is an absolute distortion. The development, perfecting, and strengthening of the bureaucratic and military apparatus has been going on all through bourgeois revolutions, of which Europe has seen so many since the fall of feudalism. It is particularly the petty bourgeoisie that is attracted to the side of the big bourgeoisie and to its allegiance largely by means of this apparatus, which provides the upper strata of the peasantry, small artisans and tradesmen, with a number of comparatively comfortable, quiet, and respectable berths, raising their holders above the people. Consider what happened in Russia during the 6 months following March 12, 1917. The government post, which hitherto had been given by preference to members of the Black Hundreds, now became the booty of cadets, Mensheviks, and SRs. Nobody really thought of any serious reform. They were to be put off until the Constituent Assembly, which, in its turn, was eventually to be put off until the end of the war. But there was no delay, no waiting for a constituent assembly in the matter of dividing the spoils, of getting a hold of the berths of ministers, assistant ministers, governor-generals, etc., etc. The game that went on of changing the combination of persons forming the provisional government was, in essence, only the expression of this division and redivision of the spoils, which was going on high and low throughout the country, throughout the central and local government. The practical results of the 6 months between March 12th and September 9th, 1917, beyond all dispute are reform shelved, distribution of officials' berths accomplished, and mistakes in the distribution corrected by a few redistributions. But the longer the process of reapportioning the bureaucratic apparatus among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, among the cadets, SRs, and Mensheviks, if we take the case of Russia, goes on, the more clearly the oppressed classes, with the proletariat at their head, realize that they are irreconcilably hostile to the whole of bourgeois society. Hence the necessity for all bourgeois parties, even the most democratic and revolutionary democratic among them, to increase the repressive measures against the revolutionary proletariat, to strengthen the apparatus of repression, that is, the same state machinery. Such a course of events compels the revolution to concentrate all its forces of destruction against the state power, and to regard the problem as one, not of perfecting the machinery of the state, but of breaking up and annihilating it. It was not logical theorizing, but the actual course of events, the living experience of 1848 through 1851, that produced such a statement of the problem. To what extent Marx held strictly to the solid ground of historical experience we can see from the fact that, in 1852, he did not as yet deal concretely with the question of what was to replace the state machinery that was to be destroyed. Experience had not yet yielded material for the solution of this problem, which history placed on the order of the day later on in 1871. What could be laid down in 1852 with the accuracy of observation characterizing the natural sciences was that the proletarian revolution had approached the task of concentrating all its forces of destruction against the state, of breaking up the governmental machinery. Here the question may arise, is it correct to generalize the experience, observations, and conclusions of Marx, to apply them to a wider field than the history of France during the 3 years of 1848 through 1851? To analyze this question, let us recall, first of all, a certain remark of Engels, and then proceed to examine the facts.
France,
wrote Engels in his introduction to the third edition of the 18th Brumaire,
is the country where, more than anywhere else, historical class struggles have always been fought through to decisive conclusion, and therefore where also the changing political forms within which the struggles developed, and in which their results were summed up, were stamped in sharpest outline. The center of feudalism in the Middle Ages, the model country, since the Renaissance, of a rigidly unified monarchy, in the Great Revolution of France, shattered feudalism and established the unadulterated rule of the bourgeoisie, in a more classical form than any other European country. And here also the struggle of the rising proletariat against the ruling bourgeoisie appeared in an acute form, such as was unknown elsewhere.
That last sentence is out of date, inasmuch as there has been a lull in the revolutionary struggle of the French proletariat since 1871, though, long as this lull may be, it in no way excludes the possibility that, in the coming proletarian revolution, France may once more reveal itself as the traditional home of the struggle of classes to a finish. Let us, however, cast a general glance over the history of the more advanced countries during the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. We shall see the same process has been going on more slowly, in more varied forms, on a much wider field. On the one hand, a development of parliamentary power not only in the republican countries, France, America, Switzerland, but also in the monarchies, England, Germany, and to an extent Italy, the Scandinavian countries, etc. On the other hand, a struggle for power of various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, distributing and redistributing the spoils of officials' berths, the foundation of capitalist society remaining all the while unchanged. Finally, the perfecting and strengthening of the executive power, its bureaucratic and military apparatus. There is no doubt that these are the features common to the latest stage in the evolution of all capitalist states generally. In the 3 years 1848 through 1851, France showed in a swift, sharp, concentrated form all those processes of development which are inherent in the whole capitalist world. Imperialism in particular, the era of banking capital, the era of gigantic capitalist monopolies, the era of the transformation of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism, shows an unprecedented strengthening of the state machinery, and an unprecedented growth of its bureaucratic and military apparatus, side by side with an increase of the repressive measures against the proletariat, alike in the monarchical and the freest republican countries. At the present time, world history is undoubtedly leading on an incomparably larger scale than in 1852 to the concentration of all the forces of proletarian revolution for the purpose of destroying the state machinery. As to what the proletariat will put in its place, instructive data on the subject were furnished by the Paris Commune. Section 3. The Formulation of the Question by Marx in 1852. This section was added by Lenin in the second Russian edition of State and Revolution, 1918.
In 1907, Mehring published in the magazine Neue Zeit extracts from a letter by Marx to Wedemeyer, dated March 5, 1852. In this letter, among other things, is the following noteworthy observation. As far as I am concerned, the honor does not belong to me for having discovered the existence either of classes in modern society or of the struggle between the classes. Bourgeois historians a long time before me expounded the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of classes. What was new on my part was to prove the following. 1. That the existence of classes is connected only with certain historical struggles which arise out of the development of production. 2. That class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. That this dictatorship is itself only a transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. In these words, Marx has succeeded in expressing with striking clearness, first, the chief and concrete differences between his teachings and those of the most advanced and profound thinkers of the bourgeoisie, and second, the essence of his teachings concerning the state. The main point in the teaching of Marx is the class struggle. This has very often been said and written, but this is not true. Out of this error, here and there, springs an opportunist distortion of Marxism, such a falsification of it as to make it acceptable to the bourgeoisie. The theory of the class struggle was not created by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and is, generally speaking, acceptable to the bourgeoisie. He who recognizes only the class struggle is not yet a Marxist. He may be found not to have gone beyond the boundaries of bourgeois reasoning and politics. To limit Marxism to the teaching of the class struggle means to curtail Marxism, to distort it, to reduce it to something which is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. A Marxist is one who extends the acceptance of the class struggle to the acceptance of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Herein lies the deepest difference between a Marxist and an ordinary, petty, or big bourgeois. On this touchstone, it is necessary to test a real understanding and acceptance of Marxism, and it is not astonishing that, when the history of Europe put before the working class this question in a practical way, not only all opportunists and reformists, but all Kautskyist, people who vacillate between reformism and Marxism, turned out to be miserable Philistines and petty bourgeois Democrats, denying the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky's pamphlet, Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in August 1918, i.e., long after the first edition of this book, is an example of petty bourgeois distortion of Marxism and base renunciation of it in practice, while hypocritically recognizing it in words. See my pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution in the Renegade Kautsky, Petrograd and Moscow, 1918. The present-day opportunism in the person of its main representative, the former Marxist Karl Kautsky, comes wholly under Marx's characterization of the bourgeois position as quoted above, for this opportunism limits the field of recognition of the class struggle to the realm of bourgeois relationships. Within this realm, inside of its framework, not a single educated liberal will refuse to recognize the class struggle in principle. Opportunism does not lead the recognition of the class struggle up to the main point, up to the period of transition from capitalism to communism, up to the period of overthrowing and completely abolishing the bourgeoisie. In reality, this period inevitably becomes a period of unusually violent class struggles in their sharpest possible forms, and therefore, the state during this period inevitably must be a state that is democratic in a new way for the proletariat and the poor in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. Further, the substance of the teaching of Marx about the state is assimilated only by one who understands the dictatorship of a single class is necessary, not only for any class society generally, not only for the proletariat which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but for the entire historic period which separates capitalism from classless society, from communism. The forms of bourgeois states are exceedingly variegated, but their essence is the same. In one way or another, all these states are in the last analysis inevitably a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism will certainly bring a great victory and abundance of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be only one, the dictatorship of the proletariat.